What next?
That was pretty damn good. Brilliant. I love that.
Press the button, Freddie.
I know where it is. I know where.
Knock, knock.
Good.
Oh, it's good.
You know, play it like you wrote it.
Well, I did. I wrote that part.
Taking the piss.
Okay. Are you happy?
I think it's beautiful.
It's almost perfect.
Almost.
Yes, give it more rock and roll.
Well, I'm always up for that, Fred.
Put your body into it.
Right, okay. Put my body into it. I got it.
Not like that.
No, I got it. I got it. A bit
All
more
right.
soul. A bit more soul.
A bit more heart.
I'll do that. We good to go, Roy? You good?
Oh, and then there's the operatic section. You're gonna love it.
The operatic section.
I know.
It sounds
I
crazy,
love it, Fred.
but I
I
don't
love
know.
it.
It could be a flop. It could work.
I love it.
What have we got to lose?
Nothing.
If you say so.
Okay, let's go.
Tiki?
How was that?
Freddie?
Higher.
Can you go a bit higher?
If I go any higher, only dogs will hear me.
Try.
Freddie's note, sorry.
Oh, go on, roll the tape.
Overdub 24 of Fred's thing.
How was that? Better?
Higher.
Jesus, how many more Galileos do you want?
Freddie wants to do
A few more overdubs.
Do we even have any tape left?
I do.
have to say the tape is wearing out.
It can't take much more.
Yeah, we can't afford much more. We're already 3 weeks over schedule.
Dub 26 of Fred's thing.
One more. One more. Again.
Go on, roll the track. Who even is Galileo? My nuts feel like they're in my chest right now. Are we done?
That's it. He loves you.
Poor boy, nobody loves me.
That's it. It's beautiful.
Easy come,
Love it.
will you let me go? Bismillah, no.